Coming up from Call to Mind, most of the people in America's prisons and jails have a mental illness, a substance use disorder, or both. But is incarceration the right thing for them?
You know, there had been times when I was in my jail cell in prison and on my bed, and I just dreamed of something different. I've always wanted something better, even though I couldn't change myself at that moment.
Advocates say our correction systems need to be redesigned to do a better job handling people with mental illness and to keep them from coming back.
You can't fix this on the back end. By the time someone has been arrested, we failed miserably, and fixing it at that time is much more difficult.
I'm Kimberly Adams. Join us for Incarcerated with Mental Illness. We'll hear from people who have lived with mental illness while incarcerated and about new approaches in the criminal justice system. Incarcerated with Mental Illness. That's over the coming hour from Call to Mind. First, the news. You're listening to Incarcerated with Mental Illness, a broadcast special from Call to Mind, American Public Media's initiative to foster new conversations about mental health. I'm Kimberly Adams.
From the age of 2, I basically began my journey with foster care. I was a state ward, and I lived my life basically in and out of foster homes and in and out of juvenile facilities.
That's Jody Carey. She lives in Minnesota, and we met her through People Incorporated, a community-based mental health nonprofit.
When you're involved in the system, I think what happens is you're never in one spot for too long. I lived with my grandma after my father died. I started to be having behavior problems. And so my grandma couldn't handle me. You know, the social worker brought me back and made me a state ward of Hennepin County. And then I was off to another place. Well, then I would run away or start having problems. So you never really address the issue. You just get shuffled around. And then what happens is the problems, the behaviors, they start to accumulate.
Jody is one person out of millions who have been incarcerated. And when you hear her story, you might wonder if the criminal justice system was the right place for her from the start. More than 70% of people in U.S. prisons and jails have a mental illness, a substance use disorder, or both. And for many of them, the first time they get help with their condition is when they are incarcerated.
You know, I used to steal, lipstick from Woolworths to buy cigarettes. And then I ended up stealing clothing to buy drugs. So it just accumulates in life, and you get to the point where you're like, I don't even know how I'm here. Like, now I'm 20 years old and now I'm in prison.
The prevalence of mental illness in folks who are incarcerated is higher than the general population. Dr. Sharon Barboza says simply being incarcerated can affect someone's mental health once they're in there. Dr. Barboza is a clinical psychologist with more than 25 years of experience working within correctional systems.
When you take a person and you pull them out of the community and you put them in a carceral setting, there's probably isolation, right? They're away from any support systems that they may have had. They're in a non-pleasant place. Prisons are not pleasant. They are in many cases falling apart. We don't fund the upkeep of those buildings. So they're falling apart and they're leaking and they're smelly and there are locked doors and loud noises. There's a lot of distrust amongst peers, so incarcerated to incarcerated, as well as mistrust between the incarcerated and the staff and the incarcerated, right? So there's just kind of this global feeling of dis-ease and mistrust. Also, in lots of cases, there can be a sense of hopelessness. I'm here, I don't see an end to this, right? And we know that hopelessness can feed into depression and sometimes thoughts of suicide, as well as burdensomeness is a serious problem, right? We think about burdensomeness. If I'm incarcerated, maybe if I used to earn money and be a productive member of society and my family, now I'm a burden to them. And that also can lead folks down a path of thinking that death may be better than life, right? So suicidal thoughts. It's also kind of loud and punitive. And so if folks with serious mental health needs are unable to respond quickly, say, to a direction, or unable to completely understand what's being asked of them, that's met with punishment and not support. So overall, it can exacerbate already existing conditions. And then for some folks, certainly it can be traumatizing in and of itself to be incarcerated. So it can create anxiety that possibly didn't exist before. It can create re-trauma. It can trigger for them memories of previous trauma, which can be debilitating in that setting.
Because there are such high rates of mental illness in correctional settings, jails and prisons have become some of the largest mental health providers in the country. Dr. Barboza said the situation is not ideal, but these institutions have a responsibility.
It is understood that when we hold a person in a carceral setting, we are required by the Constitution of the United States to provide them with health care. To not do so at this point is considered cruel and unusual punishment. And we like to say in jails and prisons, the incarceration is the punishment. Folks shouldn't be further punished once incarcerated. So if you're incarcerated with any health condition, it's the responsibility of the facility to take care of that condition. Now, what gets tricky is that there are no national standards that are mandated in terms of what that must look like. In most systems, however, there is an expectation that when folks hit the door, there's some sort of screening where folks are assessed kind of at a very basic level to say, do you have a serious health need that needs to be met right now? In most systems, if that's triggered, those folks move on to a more comprehensive assessment, depending on the size of the facility. That could be within days, that could be within weeks, and then hopefully become enrolled in some kind of mental health program, or at least be set up for routine outpatient contacts where they're seen for ongoing medication management if they take medications, or maybe some groups if they're lucky, and hopefully some case management or psychotherapy.
It almost sounds like the role of a hospital.
It awfully does. Yes, it sounds like what we would expect to happen. And I think that you are realizing all of that's happening behind bars and walls and keys and locks and handcuffs. And right, so it's not a hospital. The expectations are there that it should be, and yet the physical environment is not that.
For a person with a mental illness or substance use disorder, are there ways that incarceration can actually be helpful?
It's a complicated question. I think for some individuals, in some cases, it can feel like some level of stability for folks who don't have a place to live and are living on the streets, or folks who live in dangerous environments. Even if they have a home, there can be some respite in kind of the predictability of a prison setting. But again, the needs of these folks from a mental health standpoint exceed what can reasonably be provided day to day. And so it's a mixed bag. But I do know that there have been, I worked at a juvenile facility at one point, and I remember one of the young boys who was there sharing with me that the facility was the safest place he'd ever been.
Wow.
Right, because he had just been in so many awful places that finally he was in a place where he had a bed and some meals and some people looking out for him. And so I can imagine that that can be true for grown-ups as well.
What about for you as a provider? I imagine it's a bit easier to keep track of a struggling client when you know where they're going to be every day.
That's absolutely true in a host of ways, right? When in an outpatient setting, if I have a patient who comes to me who's, say, struggling with thoughts of suicide or depression or hopelessness, there's a pretty high bar for me having to take steps to, say, hospitalize that person. And so they will leave my office and we will have a plan, and that person leaves my office, right? And I'm assuming and hoping that they go home and they follow the plan. Whereas in a setting like an institution, if a patient is having those same thoughts and feelings, come up with a safety plan and they leave my office, I can say to the patient, hey, tonight I'm going to have somebody come by and check on you. And so both the patient and I can feel a little bit better that there are eyes around, that there are resources around. So certainly there is something to be said for the watchful eyes in that setting.
That was Dr. Sharon Barboza, a clinical psychologist based in the state of New York. You're listening to Incarcerated with Mental Illness, a broadcast special from Call to Mind. I'm Kimberly Adams. Dr. Barboza has in many correctional systems throughout the United States. She told us if you've seen one prison system, you've seen one prison system. She means that the quality of care for an incarcerated person depends on where they are. The reasons people end up in court also depends on where they are. For example, teenagers accused of violent crimes in Maryland are automatically charged as adults, but they can ask a judge to move their case to juvenile court. An investigation by WYPR and APM Reports has found that judges and prosecutors use what advocates describe as arbitrary and inconsistent reasons to keep those teens in adult court. Rachel Bay reports.
This is Kevin. He's 17 years old, grew up in Washington, D.C., and loves playing basketball.
That's all I really do, play basketball, go to the movies with girls and stuff like that.
By the time he turned 16, he had already been through more trauma than most people experience in their whole lives. He was sexually abused by a relative at age 6. Then, in a single year, Kevin held one of his closest friends in his arms while he was dying. He was shot, and the stepfather who raised him was murdered.
I felt like I didn't care. Like, I felt like the world wasn't giving me no chances, so why give anybody else a chance? Like, I want to say hopeless, but I really felt like it wasn't getting no better.
Toward the end of that horrible year, police charged Kevin with carjacking. We're identifying Kevin by his middle name because he is a minor. Because of a controversial law in Maryland, teens like Kevin who are arrested for carjacking and a lot of other crimes, like assault and gun possession, are automatically charged in adult court. Each year, Maryland automatically charges hundreds of juveniles in adult court, more than almost any other state. Nearly all of the teens charged are Black boys. Research shows teens are more likely to reoffend when they are charged as adults. We reviewed more than 36 hearings to see how judges made decisions to keep cases in adult court. We found judges and prosecutors sometimes relied on dubious reasoning to argue teens should be tried as adults. For example, this is Baltimore City Judge Emmanuel Brown.
He is listed physically as being 6 feet 1 inches tall and 164.4 pounds. That factor weighs against transfer.
Chronic absences from school, sexual activity, and tattoos were among the reasons offered. We also came across decisions that seemed to contradict each other. Getting decent grades or skipping school would be used in different cases to say the same thing. A kid should be tried as an adult. Or mental illness, if it's severe or not severe enough. Both would be evidence that teens should stay in adult court.
The first word that comes to mind is horrendous.
Natasha Dartigue reviewed our findings. She is the head of the Maryland Office of the Public Defender.
We're talking about children, and that they would make such comments is absolutely appalling.
If Kevin gets transferred to juvenile court, he could access some of the $25 million worth of treatment programs the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services offers each year for traumatized teens like Kevin. But for him to access these services, his lawyer, Ian Allgarten, has to convince a judge that he is amenable to treatment, essentially that he would engage in juvenile services programs and the programs would help him. This hearing will decide whether Kevin's case stays in adult court.
Your Honor, we're here on our motion to transfer. A couple things preliminarily. I've had Mark.
At Kevin's hearing, a social worker testified that he needs the therapy he'd get in the juvenile system. And a family friend told the court that Kevin has a supportive community.
We do a lot of family things, like the bingos and the unos and the dominoes, video games.
Has he been considerate or respectful of your home during the time he spent in it?
Yes, always.
As he announced his decision, Prince George's County Judge Michael Whalen recalled what the family friend said, that Kevin was respectful and courteous at home around the same time he committed a crime.
So I think can be as manipulative as anyone as well.
Whalen denied Kevin's transfer to juvenile court.
And having the support that he did, unlike a lot of other youth that we see before us, I do not believe that he is amenable for treatment, or that he would genuinely participate in any treatment that could be offered to him in juvenile court.
Marianne Scully is a juvenile justice advocate with the Galt Center. When she heard about Wayland's and other judges' decisions, she said they sounded arbitrary.
Those same bases could, of course, be used as rationale to transfer young people to the system meant for young people, the juvenile system.
A spokesman for the Maryland courts declined to comment on particular cases. In an email, he said judges must consider the totality of circumstances for each case, including the nature of the alleged crime and public safety. He said defendants must prove their amenability to treatment to be transferred. For years, a small group of state legislators have tried to change the law automatically charging teens as adults. Year after year, the efforts failed as elected prosecutors fought the changes. Prosecutors and judges have said in interviews, public hearings, and courtrooms that they don't trust the juvenile system to keep the public safe. This is Prince George's County State's Attorney Aisha Braveboy.
The whole reason that we're seeing this big debate around juvenile justice in Maryland is because we've had a number of young people who were treated in the juvenile system and who were not rehabilitated and who were back committing very serious offenses.
Strengthening the juvenile system is a top priority for Governor Wes Moore. But the bill he is backing during this year's legislative session won't change Maryland's law charging teens as adults. In the meantime, it's up to judges to decide who gets a chance at treatment in the juvenile system and who, like Kevin, will be tried as an adult. For Call to Mind, I'm Rachel Bay from WYPR News.
You can read the whole investigation about how juveniles in Maryland are judged in court at apmreports.org. The story in Baltimore is one example of a legal system and process that many advocates are pushing to redesign. Correctional systems often serve as de facto mental health providers for people who are cycling in and out of prisons and jails and can't stabilize their behavior. Jody Carey, who we heard from at the top of the show, told us during the years she struggled with mental health and substance use problems, she was charged with more than 34 felonies, and says there were times when being incarcerated saved her life.
As much as I, hated going to jail, that was my safe place. As hard as it may be for people to understand, but that was my home. I was safe there. I was able to, get myself together and feel well again and, add some nutrients to my body, socialize with people, have a sense of consistency for whatever time it was that I was going to be incarcerated. And then that became my way of life.
Is it fair to say that jail and prison was stabilizing for you?
It was very stabilizing. I got my GED while I was in jail. I did sewing. I worked out a lot. I took classes, but I just couldn't get it together when I got out. I didn't know how to survive. I didn't understand that the jail was the Band-Aid for the problem. And then when I got out, I had like this open wound of life and didn't know how to process that and deal with that. I didn't know, about my behaviors and I didn't know how to change those. And I didn't know how to really believe in myself.
What happened when you were in court the last time and looking at possible incarceration time that took you on another path?
There'd been times in when I was in my, jail cell in prison and on my bed, and I just dreamed of something different. I've always wanted something better, right? Like, even though I couldn't change myself at that moment, every time that I went to prison, I got a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And that kind of became my journey with healing myself and facing my trauma and accepting the fact that I had PTSD. And not only did I have it, but it was complex. And finding those tools to combat that when I had that. And the anxiety, and I had to face those things. And that was a very hard time for me. of the treatment, the trauma treatment I went to. It was very hard, but I had to do something different. I just was so tired of living on the street.
In Miami, Florida, Steve Leifman is a well-known administrative judge for the 11th Judicial Circuit Court. Judge Leifman says America's criminal justice system falls short when it comes to people, like Jody, who are convicted of crimes and who live with mental illness or substance use disorders. So, for more than 20 years, Leifman has been on a mission to reform the way people with mental health conditions are treated in the criminal justice system. His crusade started early in his career.
When I started as a young lawyer, we had very few, if any, cases involving people with mental illnesses. I was an assistant public defender, and in my 7th or 8th year, I was head of the county court criminal division. And that was the first year we started to notice an influx of cases. Why? Because the local state hospital had closed. And we had zero. It's not like someone came and knocked on our door and said, next week you're going to get this influx of individuals with serious mental illnesses. You need to be prepared for it. They just showed up. By the time I became a judge a couple years later, there were 3 of 9 floors housing people with mental illnesses. And it was primarily because that hospital had closed. And this population went from hospitals to the street and into jail. And it's a horrific thing that we've done. And at the same time, when I started as a judge, there was zero training for judges on how to identify people with mental illnesses in court, how to talk to people with mental illnesses in court, and what to do with the cases.
Judge Leifman often talks about one particular case that continues to bother him.
So I was getting ready to go on the bench, and the assistant public defender and the assistant state attorney came to my chambers, and they asked to talk to me. And they said that there was a couple in court whose son was in jail, and they really thought I needed to talk to them. They told me that their son was brilliant. He had gone to Harvard. He had a late onset of schizophrenia. He was now homeless, and he was cycling through the criminal and homelessness system. And they were distraught, and they literally began to beg me to get their son help. So I promised them I would get their son help. And I went into the courtroom, and we started to have an amazing conversation. He was coherent. He was brilliant. He was thoughtful. He was more respectful than the lawyers. He didn't seem like he had any kind of mental health disorder, except when you looked at him, he looked like a homeless guy that hadn't bathed in months. So he kept insisting there was absolutely nothing wrong with him, that he had no type of mental health disorder. And so he said, look, if you release me, I'll go see a doctor, I'll get evaluated, I'll come back. And I thought, well, maybe I should do that because this is ridiculous to keep him in jail. And I said, can I ask you a question? He's like, sure, Your Honor, anything. I said, you keep insisting there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. But if that's the case, why would a Harvard-educated psychiatrist be in jail, be homeless, and cycling through these systems? And all of a sudden, he got a look on his face that I tell you, I will not forget to the day I die. It was a look of complete fear and terror. And he got this look on his face that I think someone gets right before they think they're going to die. And he started screaming at the top of his lungs. So I immediately order a psychological evaluation. First evaluation comes back in a few weeks, and it said that he was incompetent and he was so sick he met Florida's very narrow criteria for civil commitment because he was imminently dangerous to himself or others. And I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm going to be a hero. I'm going to get this guy help. And at the time, I needed 3 evaluations to get the lawyers in agreement. All 3 evaluations come back and they say the same thing. Incompetent to proceed, and he is imminently dangerous to self or others. I'm like, great. So I give the evaluations to the lawyers. They stipulate to the report. They agree that he's incompetent. I make a finding. I adjudicate him incompetent, and I begin to order him into some kind of treatment because that would be the logical thing to do. And so I remember looking down, and the public defender, who probably had more experience at that point than I did on the bench doing these cases, said to me, Your Honor, in all due respect, And she whips out this Florida Supreme Court opinion, and it said that county court judges, of which I am, have zero legal authority to involuntarily commit or forensically commit anybody, that my only option was to release him back to the street, tell him to go see a psychiatrist, exactly what he had done 12 weeks earlier, and to come back, which I had to do. And even though I hated it, I still have to follow the law. I'm not an activist judge in terms of not following the law. And I was livid. And, not only was I unable to fulfill the promise I made the parents, I put him at risk. I put the community at risk. I probably put my job at risk. God forbid something terrible happened to him or he did something terrible to someone else. But I followed the law. And I was never going to be in that position again.
After this experience, Judge Leifman founded the Miami-Dade Criminal Mental Health Project. He believed there could be a better, more humane, and cost-effective way to handle cases involving people with mental illnesses.
People with mental illnesses, number one, are no more dangerous than the general population. On medication, quite candidly, they're much less dangerous than the general population. And tragically, by a huge, huge margin, they're much more likely to be victims of violent crimes than perpetrators. So you don't really have that as a main fear, no greater fear than you would of anyone else you're talking to in society that doesn't have a mental illness. I will tell you on drugs, the dangerousness quotient goes up a little bit, but still it's not what people think it is. One of the problems of mental health in America is that most of our civil commitment laws are 60 years old, and they don't reflect technology, medicine, science, or research. Think about it. We didn't have MRIs, CAT scans, anything. We knew very little about the brain. But we're using the same laws that have not kept up with the medicine and research. So they're out of date. They need to be modernized. And the way to look at it is just like we look at cancer, right? It's so much better to have your cancer identified in the early stages, and we usually can cure it and treat it, and you can live a long, healthy life. But if we wait too long and it metastasizes and does a lot of damage, it's a lot harder to treat you. Well, it's the same with a mental illness. The longer we wait, the more damage is done, the more gray matter may be destroyed, and it's something that won't come back.
We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll hear more from Judge Steve Leifman and about new approaches to reform the criminal justice system. That's coming up on Incarcerated with Mental Illness, a Call to Mind special from American Public Media. Welcome back to Incarcerated with Mental Illness, a broadcast special from Call to Mind, American Public Media's initiative to foster new conversations about mental health. I'm Kimberly Adams. Since the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, many cities are thinking strategically about public safety, the role of law enforcement in mental health emergencies, and ways they can prevent any other tragic deaths. A new program in Minneapolis called the Behavioral Crisis Response now runs 24/7 as part of the city's emergency 911 system. It's helped the city become a national leader in deploying trained, unarmed responders to help people experiencing mental health crises. John Collins from NPR News has the story.
The two emergency responders climb into their big Sprinter van and rattle off to a welfare call in northeast Minneapolis. They work for the city's Behavioral Crisis Response Unit, or BCR, and they've been told a nurse reported that a patient sounded disoriented. Their van is wheelchair accessible and has seats for people who need transport to the hospital or a safe place at a family member's house. Responder Jesse Grandin says the cabinets in the van are packed with supplies for all sorts of situations responders might encounter.
Supplies like water and snacks. These would be seasonal supplies, fidgets, different things like that might help us on interventions.
The responders don't carry weapons and aren't licensed police officers. The white van is marked with BCR's name and a logo for the city of Minneapolis, but they don't have sirens or flashing lights. Grandin says that's to avoid alarming someone who already may be distraught.
We just take an approach where we're very calm, open stance, try to be more empowering, offer choices, and so I think that helps people be more receptive.
The woman doesn't answer the door, and there's no sign she's home. Minneapolis Police Department officers swing by to help investigate. Officer Christopher Perry says he's run into BCR responders all over town.
Does this make your job easier, having these folks?
It does. Absolutely it does, yes. Yeah, they're a blessing, that's for sure. It takes a lot of weight off our shoulders. And once you build that network that they can call people that we don't have resources to, it's great to have them, for sure, yeah. Wish that there's more of them.
Responder Alex Anderson says while officers are trained to maintain control in a situation, crisis responders are trained to let the patient dictate the care they receive. Sometimes it's a bottle of water or connection to a social worker. If a situation escalates, they can always call for backup from other emergency responders.
If we need police to help, they always come and help us, and police can tell when our approach is better and they request us to come out frequently. Seems to be a good kind of having both of us around.
A database maintained by the Washington Post has found that about a quarter of people killed by police officers are experiencing a mental health crisis. And city officials wanted to find ways to minimize the chance that something could go wrong on a police call. Canopy Mental Health and Consulting Executive Director Candace Hansen says the project fits with their mission and skills as a majority Black-owned mental health provider.
A member of a historically marginalized group or currently marginalized group, when you have an authority figure coming at you from the stance of, I'm the authority and I know what's best for you, you don't tend to get very good outcomes.
The project launched with limited hours at the end of 2021. With almost $6 million in total financial support from the city, the program now has 36 full and part-time around-the-clock responders. Hansen says responders help free up the Minneapolis Police Department for other calls at a time when the department is several hundred officers short. In 16,000 emergency calls the group has responded to since the end of 2021, no responders have been seriously injured, although one was punched.
Mental health professionals and social workers have been going out into the community unarmed forever. We've been doing that as long as the profession existed.
The Minneapolis, Minnesota program isn't alone in the country. Jason Beck is a senior program associate with the Vera Institute of Justice. He says a couple programs have existed for decades, but it wasn't widespread until George Floyd's killing. The programs vary widely in their approach, and data on them so far is spotty. But a Stanford University study of Denver's program found that it helped reduce crime in the region.
The researchers said they found evidence that the program reduced reports of crimes like trespassing, public disorder, resisting arrest, the kinds of things that would be associated with crisis situations that come to the attention of 911 and are a better fit for these civilian staffed programs.
The researchers said the program keeps people experiencing a mental health crisis out of the criminal justice system and gets them help, which prevents crime in the future and unnecessary incarcerations. And the study found some benefits for police too. They estimated that about 2/3 of low-priority calls that police traditionally responded to could be directed to civilian mental health experts. Minneapolis City Council President Elliot Payne says behavioral crisis response is just one of many steps the city needs to take to expand public safety beyond policing.
In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, people were scared to call 911 because they didn't want somebody in crisis to be at risk of a police-involved shooting, and they didn't want to have it heavy on their soul that they may have caused that. Now I can go out to my community and proudly say, the very first thing you should do is call 911. It's our job as the city to make sure that we have the right service provider for you. Your job is to make sure that we know that there's a crisis happening.
Responder Grandin has worked with BCR since the beginning and says she's proud of what the program has accomplished.
I love the work we do. I do think it makes a difference. I will say that we're a cool drink of water in the moment, offering relief to somebody. There's not going to be closure on this job, but that's not our role. Our role is to kind of help somebody in crisis in the moment and offer whatever we can, to help them get to the next moment and hopefully connect to longer term resources.
For Call to Mind, I'm John Collins from NPR News.
Experts agree the overlap of mental illness and the criminal justice system is a bad fit, but has become unavoidable. Dr. Sharon Barboza, who we heard from earlier, says prison health is community health. The well-being of our sickest neighbors has an impact on all of us.
I believe that we need to think about how we take better care of folks with serious mental health needs who find themselves acting out of kind of order with what we expect from folks, so that they're finding themselves breaking the law or having interpersonal challenges or having to live in places that aren't homes. How can we help those folks without locking them up? And I think that that's going to take a lot of creative thinking, because we really do have a very kind of black and white way of thinking about rule violation and law breaking in this country, right? You break a law, lock them up. That's like a knee-jerk reaction. And yet I don't think that when folks say that, they fully appreciate what they're sentencing a fellow human being to have to endure, especially when that person is suffering from a condition that makes that place unbelievably challenging. So I just think we need to do a better job of figuring out how we help people before they get to that point.
In our preparation for this interview, you mentioned the idea that prison health should be community health. Can you explain that?
We are a community, all of us. Every single person who lives in this country is a member of our community. And when any member of our community is unwell, our community is unwell. And so when we have folks who are struggling with mental health needs and we punish them, we lock them up, we put them away, and then if we don't help them to become more healthy, more stable, then when they leave the carceral setting, which they will, 95% of folks who are incarcerated will return to our communities. When they return, they are going to return less well or equally unwell as they were when they went in, making therefore our free society more unwell, right? With each unwell person, we are more unwell. And so if, on the other hand, we have this opportunity, the unfortunate reality that we have right now, which is that many people who are incarcerated are mentally ill, if while we have them in those settings, we're able to support them with true care and treatment, such that they can leave us more stable with a better understanding of their illness and their needs, and they can re-enter our communities and continue to stay well, our communities will be well, right? It's such a bright line to me of how we can make things better. And I think overall, it can be said for folks even without mental illness, folks with, less serious illness, even physical health conditions, right? If we can take better care of people, people will be better. It's so basic. And I hope for it every day.
What are the consequences of not giving appropriate mental health care in these settings?
I think the consequences are large. So one is, just at its base, you have unnecessary suffering. So you have individuals who are suffering who will continue to suffer. And then I think secondarily, you have unwell people affecting families, affecting the larger communities, right? For some of these folks, their behavior can be unpredictable, in some cases dangerous. And so they can harm others. They can harm themselves. They can put staff at risk. They can die. I mean, it's huge to not take appropriate and proper care of these folks. And then when they are released from our settings, they return to the community in bad shape. And then those issues and concerns spill into where the rest of us are.
You're listening to Incarcerated with Mental Illness, a broadcast special from Call to Mind. I'm Kimberly Adams. So what would a redesigned model look like? Earlier in the program, we heard from Judge Steve Leifman, who's helped make Miami-Dade County a national leader in criminal justice reform. Since starting the Criminal Mental Health Project there in 2000, Leifman has helped change the way people with mental illness and substance use disorders are treated by Miami's court system. Call to Mind's Jessica Bari spent a day in court.
Judge, next I'm going to call Eileen Rojas on page 38.
How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling stable.
Excellent. I'd like to hear that.
Thank you.
Let me get a report.
It's a typical day in court in the Miami-Dade Criminal Mental Health Project. I'm sitting in the courthouse observing a public hearing with Judge Maria Eliana Verde on the bench.
Judge, she tested negative today. She has an appointment for individual therapy with Village Rehabilitation on April 4th. She started a new job this week, assisting doing handyman work in the South Miami area, and reports all as well.
Good. How do you like your new job?
It's hard work.
What are you doing?
Doing painting and landscaping, so I've humbled myself, but I'm proud of myself for taking on the job.
So
Judge Verde is the primary judge in the mental health division. At a glance, the courtroom looks like any legal hearing. There are attorneys, probation officers, and court reporters. Defendants answer questions from the judge. But what feels different is Judge Verde has gotten to know the people appearing before her, and she's invested in their well-being. The judge asks them how they're doing in their treatment programs and if they're staying on their medication and doing the needed work in therapy. She's warm and friendly, but she's also determined to help defendants stay on track. Like when one young woman describes a mistake she made.
I was on the train station, and this boy had a vape. So I smoked it.
That's not a good idea.
So when I looked inside the vape, it looked like a marijuana bud. After I finished telling him that I'm on probation, but it looked like it was marijuana on there. I see the marijuana.
There are so many issues with that story you're telling me. Number one, why are you taking a vape from a boy on the train?
I just wanted to get some nicotine in my system.
That's a bad idea. You don't do that.
Looking on from the side of the courtroom is Alejandro Aristizabal. He's a leader with the Criminal Mental Health Project and has been working there since the beginning. A big part of Alejandro's work is the jail diversion program.
What jail diversion does is it diverts you from a regular criminal justice as usual trial setting, but instead of being treated like a criminal in the system, we're talking about recovery. We have a team of 20-something professionals that will assist in transitioning people effectively from the jail to the community that have a serious mental illness. You have a legal agreement that the person could get a dismissal of the charges or a lower sentencing in order to adhere with treatment.
A person needs to qualify for such a jail diversion offer, and there are criteria.
Persons that are diagnosed with a serious and mental illness, and there's basically only 4 of those that we accept. That's schizophrenia, bipolar, schizoaffective disorder, and major depression. After that, we're going to take a look at some other factors, the legal factors. There are disqualifiers, murder cases, arson cases, child abuse cases. But after we establish, yes, we haven't identified a candidate, we'll get into the legal part and let the lawyers give us a legal approval.
Mr. Pender, come on up. Are you still living with your friends?
Yes, ma'am.
Last time I saw you, you told me you were putting your recovery first. Is that still the case?
Yes, this is still in the pack. My recovery always first. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm very happy to hear that.
A big part of what this court does for those who qualify is help transition people out of jail and into a program where they can get the right treatment and make a plan for recovery. Julie Reed is a good example of someone who needed this kind of help. When she was a teenager, Julie struggled with her mental health and was in and out of the hospital. She had substance use problems, and to support her addiction, Julie committed petty crimes.
I was in jail for 30 days, and during my first court hearing, they offered me probation. but I had done probation a couple of years before, and it really wasn't helpful. The attorney that was working with me, my public defender, and she's like, oh, well, I know this program, and then I know this guy, so let me give him a call, and he'll come and talk to you if you want to hear about the program and if you're interested. And I'm like, yeah.
Julie was a participant in the jail diversion program. She spent 4 months in a residential treatment facility and did a 6-month outpatient program. Julie got connected to mental health providers and could focus on her recovery. Then, she spent time repairing the important stuff.
I burnt a lot of bridges. My relationships with my family and my kids were just, but everything is good. I've got 3 grandkids now, and I've found just happiness in my life and just like a peace that I can't explain.
Julie hasn't had legal problems or hospitalization since she went through the program. She got her peer support certification and for 13 years has been helping people with similar challenges. Peer support specialists are what the court team calls the secret sauce. They are certified members of the jail diversion program and key players in helping participants succeed.
So I'm Stephen Williams. I am a peer specialist for the jail diversion program. What I was taught was that the role of a peer is pretty much just to be a friend, so people know that on their journey, they're not alone.
Stephen is open about his own experiences with mental illness and substance use problems. He shares his experiences to give others hope that they can succeed and deserve a second chance.
If I know someone has been through the struggle and they're on the other side of that, I'm more apt to look at their example, emulate that, because I want the results that they received. So I think that's why it's good to give someone a second chance. I believe everything we go through in life is not for us. It's always to help out the next person.
On an average day, peer support specialists often sit with their clients in court. They might meet up for lunch and serve as an understanding ear, or help secure critical resources like a medical appointment or even a place to live. I heard one thing over and over during my visit. Miami's program is not a slap on the wrist or an easy way for people to avoid jail. It's hard work. Participants must follow a mental health treatment plan, which often includes medication, different kinds of therapy, and taking drug tests. All kinds of cases appear in Judge Verde's courtroom, from simple drug possession to attempted murder. One young guy had threatened to commit mass shootings, but he was evaluated and found to be a candidate for the criminal mental health program. It might seem unsettling to have someone who is so potentially dangerous out in the community, but Judge Verde asks, what's the alternative?
People go to jail, they serve their time, they get out and they reoffend, and it does no one any good. I think people have this misconception that treatment court means you get a pass, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
The rates of people returning to jail from the misdemeanor program decreased from 75% to 20%. And people who completed the felony program committed new crimes at a rate of just 6%. The Criminal Mental Health Project has been so effective that the community is investing even more in the system, with Judge Steve Leifman in the lead.
All righty. So thank you all for coming.
The judge is leading a tour of a building under renovation in a central Miami neighborhood. For more than 20 years, the judge has expanded the Miami-Dade Criminal Mental Health Project, and this building represents his ultimate goal.
This building so unique is a one-stop shop for the most acutely ill that constantly cycle between the jail, homelessness, and hospitalization again and again and again.
When Judge Leifman created the Miami-Dade Criminal Mental Health Project, he wanted to reform the way people with mental illnesses are treated throughout the criminal justice system. That's why the building is designed to be as welcoming as possible.
Because if you had cancer or heart disease, this is what it looks like. But if you have mental illness, it doesn't look like this.
He says the project has already saved the county millions of dollars over the years. Miami-Dade closed one of its 3 main jails, which cost $12 million a year to run. Leifman says this building will save taxpayers even more money while improving public safety. Plus, it will give people who are sick a chance to live a life with opportunity. For Call to Mind, I'm Jessica Bari.
You are listening to Incarcerated with Mental Illness, a broadcast special from Call to Mind. I'm Kimberly Adams. This program just scratches the surface of all the issues we could talk about on the topic of mental illness and the criminal justice system. Advocates say that redesigning these systems is incredibly complicated and will take a huge overhaul. But at the center of this abstract issue are the lives of people. Let's return to Jodi Carey. Jodi's criminal case was moved to a mental health court, and she started therapy for trauma and complex PTSD, as well as recovery for her substance use problems. She's now active in support groups and got a certification as a peer recovery specialist. Jodi's now in her 50s, renting her own place for the first time.
I just remember getting my keys from the landlord. And on my way there, I was like, wow, like you did this, like you held on and you didn't give in. And that night I spent in my house, like I just was like, this was worth it. This was so worth it. To be able to go to my fridge when I want, eat what I want, to be able to go and sit outside anytime I wanted to. I didn't have to, wait until a movement time. When I was in prison, you have to wait till movement. I didn't have to do any of that. I was able to dictate what I was going to do in life because of how far I've worked, how hard I worked, and because of some of the opportunities I was given to be able to figure out who I was. It was just amazing. It was super amazing.
You've been listening to Incarcerated with Mental Illness, a broadcast special from Call to Mind, American Public Media's initiative to foster new conversations about mental health. Support for this program is provided by the Sozo Safe Foundation and the David and Laura Lovell Foundation. This program was produced and written by our senior producer, Jessica Bari, and edited by Stephen Smith. Our technical director is Alex Simpson. Chris Julin, Annika Best, and Nancy Rosenbaum provided production support. And this show was hosted by me, Kimberly Adams. Follow Call to Mind on our social channels at Call to Mind Now, and find resources and all of our past programs on our website at calltomindnow.org. Thank you for joining us for Incarcerated with Mental Illness, a broadcast special by Call to Mind from American Public Media.